Marvel's Spider-Man the Animated Series by Disney has always been something of a curiosity to me. I remember when this show was announced, it was announced as a back-to-basics Spider-Man TV reboot. Unlike Ultimate Spider-Man, which delved into every single corner of Spidey's mythology, in a very hyperactive, kid-friendly fashion, Marvel's Spider-Man promised to be the grounding that Spider-Man would need after Ultimate Spider-Man. Which makes only sense because Spider-Man is one of the more grounded characters in superhero mythology, and Peter Parker is, of course, about as grounded as it gets. He is the everyman superhero, the hero that could be you. So this show, if done right, would be something of a return to form to the spectacular Spider-Man, right? And what's strange about this is I didn't really watch this show until today, which is crazy because they do a breakfast cereal with this version of Spider-Man, which I ate and enjoyed, and a notepad of Marvel Spider-Man, which I take to uni every day, to take no notes in because I am a geek and I have no shame. It's really more just a doodle pad, I'm not really the notes-taking kind of guy. I do recall seeing an episode involving an ice man. He steals this ice ray from Harry Osborn's backpack, and Spider-Man fights him and he becomes kind of like Mr. Freeze in a way, and then he makes a giant ice kaiju which Harry Osborn defeats with a sword that he made himself out of fire. I also remember an episode where Peter and Miles Morales fight side by side to take on Kraven the Hunter, who's now a game show host, a bit more like the Ultimate Spider-Man version. So yeah, back to basics. I didn't think much of these, in fact I thought they were more on the bad side of things than good. But I guess context is everything, so I did tonight sit down and watch the first episode of Marvel's Spider-Man 2017. Now, here's what I have to say about that first episode. They laid it on a little thick with just about everything. So I get the sense that this was very much made to sort of emulate like an anime. It's supposed to be sort of like a Spider-Man anime in a way. The art style, the way it's animated, the expressions, the vocal performances, it all feels like a very low-budget USA anime emulation. And I don't mind the presentation of this. Like, usually one of the first things people complain about when entering a new Spider-Man show is the animation. And I think it looks fine. I actually quite like the art style and the animation. The character redesigns aren't too bad. Definitely the human alter ego characters are not quite what I think they're supposed to be, especially with Harry Osborn and Peter Parker. But more on that later, as their character designs are supposed to kind of evoke the character themselves, and that's kind of the core problem with the characterization. The music works. It doesn't feel quite as inventive with its instrumentation as, say, Spectacular Spider-Man, but it's, you know, it's music that just works. It's nothing special. Spider-Man's theme itself is more just a simple motif that's very horn-based, and it actually kind of reminds me of sort of military field training sort of a sound to it. It's certainly different from any previous Spider-Man theme music, and that's fine. I think my main issue with the presentation is sometimes you get cuts to long shots, for example, and the long shots kind of give off the geography of a battle or a fight scene or something, and the geography of it doesn't make any sense. We've got this scene near the beginning where there's a cop shootout with some guys that are stealing vibranium, and when it cuts to the long shot, you can see there's just one guy with vibranium standing against 4 police officers, shooting at him in point-blank range, but all of which are missing. And I don't really understand why it has to be like that. Did they just kind of cheap out on the checks for these sorts of things? Now, I do fully respect that this is a kids show, but I haven't really got this same sense of illogical geography from previous Spider-Man shows as I got here. It was legitimately enough to take me out of the moment anyway. There are a lot of moments where it looks like Peter Parker or Spider-Man is in an empty room all by himself, but then it cuts to another shot and there's loads of people in there, and it's just a weird thing. Like, I haven't really experienced that before. It feels kind of amateur. It feels like the kind of goofs I made in my Spider-Man fan film, where we're supposed to believe that the university's being evacuated, there's people clearly walking into it. Like, I acknowledge that, restrictions and constraints can cause stuff like that, but this is an animated show. There's this moment near the end of the episode where Peter Parker is kind of saving the school, and he's, fixing this device that's going haywire, and it looks like he's in there all on his own, but then suddenly he turns around and there's loads of people in that room. It's just a little bizarre, and it would usually be a nitpick, but it did have me like, whoa, okay, that was a bit weird. It was enough to take me out of the moment for first viewing. Okay, but pedantic stuff out of the way, we can get into the real meat of this. So kind of a clever thing that this show did, well I think it's kind of clever anyway, was they made the origin story in mini web episodes that people watching this show that want to find out more can go online and see. It's bonus content, essentially. I thought that was a nice way of going about doing this, because it's kind of easy to assume that everybody knows Spider-Man, everyone knows how he he comes about and everything. But if they want to seek out the answer to why he's come about in this universe, you can go online and look it up. So this first episode doesn't do the origin story, but it does kind of like a year zero sort of thing for Spider-Man. I was quite surprised to see that Spider-Man dons a homemade looking costume, obviously inspired a little bit by the Homecoming homemade suit. It's like a sort of a hoodie that he's kind of put together himself, and he's got goggles on. I guess it was kind of ballsy of Disney to do this for the entirety of the first episode and not give us the classic Spider-Man suit at any point. This is a show for kids, and you gotta kind of consider that this is probably gonna be their very first experience with Spider-Man. What was kind of interesting to me was how bizarrely similar this first episode of Marvel's Spider-Man is to the very first episode of Spectacular Spider-Man. You've got the Vulture as a major villain who's in cahoots with other science and tech devs, who carries another science and tech dev above the city, and Spider-Man's gotta save that guy. It starts with an action sequence dedicated to Spider-Man before shifting focus to Peter Parker. The formula and the skeleton of this episode clearly draws some inspiration from Spectacular Spider-Man. But the way I see it, this episode is kinda like Spectacular Spider-Man if it were made by the CW. Because the dialogue is laid on extremely thick and it is extremely over-communicative to the audience. Now again, I recognize that this is indeed a kids show, but kids are capable of understanding TV shows and cartoons without you communicating everything to them through dialogue, without you bombarding them with information. And this first episode of Marvel Spider-Man is information bombardment. It's absolute overload. You don't really have the time to enjoy anything because they're just constantly throwing information about these characters at you. And I think a lot of this would just fly over any kid's head. It's not particularly action-packed. You don't see any of Spider-Man in his classic suit in this first episode. And the dialogue is absolutely full of science and tech references that kids are just not gonna get. It just makes me wonder who this show is aimed at. Who is it made for? So we have the action sequence with Spider-Man, and where Spectacular Spider-Man showed us how cool it is to be Spider-Man, and then juxtapose that with Peter Parker going to school the next day in the next scene, Marvel Spider-Man instead decides to show us a bit of both Peter Parker and Spider-Man in its opening scene. He's fully suited up the whole time, but instead they decide to introduce some of those comedic goofball elements that come with Peter Parker. Spider-Man here is just as dorky as Peter Parker is. He starts by quoting Einstein, then he gets a pigeon stuck to his hand. Then he realizes he's on a rooftop where a pigeon coop is, and the old lady that owns the pigeons is unimpressed with him and starts trying to beat him off with an umbrella. So rather than showing us how cool Spider-Man is and how geeky Peter Parker is, they're showing us how much of a geeky loser Spider-Man is, and then showing us how much of a geeky loser Peter Parker is. I don't understand why the duality of Spider-Man is so difficult to understand. Spider-Man is cool and fun and charming. Peter Parker is not. Peter Parker is a grounded, everyday guy that lives in reality. Spider-Man is the escapism from the realism of Peter Parker's life. Now, I'm going to touch on this further just a little later on. You'll see why. Now, the reason I'm saying this is I'm going to touch on this later on. An immediate problem here is Spider-Man never shuts up, nor does he say anything that really resonates with the plot or serves it. He just flexes his IQ level at us all the time. This version of Peter Parker belongs on -R I Am Very Smart. He's absolutely insufferable, but as well as that, as I say, he talks all the time. Any thought he has, he speaks it, which I guess you could say is a lot like the thought bubbles that you would have in an old Spider-Man comic. Yeah, you could say that homage is there, but the problem here is Spider-Man is very annoying. He's just so mouthy about his intelligence. We get it, dude. You like science. You laid it on a little too thick. But then there's a moment where Peter is hugging onto a wall and he's thinking back, he's reminiscing to the past, and it feels like maybe they listened to the criticisms of Spider-Man Homecoming, like, there's not enough mention of Uncle Ben, and they overcorrected it. Because in a time where Uncle Ben is completely disconnected from this entire situation, he's just getting chased off by the old lady, he hugs onto a wall, closes his eyes and goes, Uncle Ben. And then we get this lengthy flashback of Uncle Ben trying to fix a cuckoo clock, and Peter helping him with science, and Uncle Ben tries to take a science term and turn it into, with great power comes great responsibility. It is laid on so thick. Spider-Man's interest in science and his father-son relationship with Uncle Ben is dialed up to beyond 100. It's got that CW thing where you're just like, people don't talk like this. People don't interact like this. Even people that are interested in science and love their fathers do not interact like this. So we get a brief battle with the Vulture, and then we're straight off into Peter Parker's day-to-day life, where before school every day, he goes and gets a slushie or some kind of iced coffee, bubble tea, I don't know, with Harry Osborn. Again, it's that very sort of CW millennial thing. It's like, oh look, they're at a Starbucks and they're getting iced drinks. Because that's what teenagers do, right? And that's the thing, is they do this, but then they have the gall to tell us that Aunt May has financial difficulty. Maybe if you didn't get a slushie before school every single day, Peter, we'd be fine. I guess maybe you could say that Harry Osborn pays for them, but it's never really stated. I'm fully aware that this is a nitpick. So Peter gets brain freeze, but he calls it by its scientific name, which is a really long term, which I can't remember, and then Harry comes over and says any normal person would just say brain freeze. And then he explains why the term brain freeze is incorrect scientifically because it's heat going to the brain. This science shtick is seriously getting old. We're at the beginning of the first episode and it's getting really old. I hate Peter Parker in this. I hate the guy. He's such a little flexer. We get it. You are a genius. This show makes me legitimately sympathize with Flash Thompson, who's nowhere to be found in this story. So Harry goes to a different school. He goes to Horizon High, which is a school for geniuses, whereas Peter Parker just goes to Midtown. But Harry thinks that Peter should go to Horizon High. He feels that that's a school where he truly fits in, which reminds Peter that he was supposed to help out with Horizon High's demonstration at Midtown High this exact morning, and he's late. So he gets there, he helps out and everything, and he sits down in the audience where basically Max Modell, the head of Horizon High, flexes on the entire audience at Midtown High about how great their school is, only to tell them that there's only one space left, and that applying to Horizon High is very, very difficult. It also turns out that Alistair Smythe is not a big fan of Max Modell, and he and his father are going to sabotage this display. So they basically trick Harry Osborn into making a few changes to the machine that they're going to display, which causes it to malfunction and destroy half the school, which starts fires everywhere. And for some reason, no one's really evacuated from this. Peter just kind of walks straight in there, fixes the machine, which turns out to be a cloud machine that can produce indoor rain. Max Modell accepts Peter Parker into the school before getting kidnapped by Vulture, who turns out to be a disgruntled ex-employee of Horizon High. Well, what do you know? It all connects. Spider-Man saves him, Aunt May agrees to let Peter go to Horizon High, and that's where we leave off at this big fancy tech school. Now, here's what I was saying earlier, was about how Spider-Man is supposed to be cool and radical and fun, and Peter Parker is supposed to be grounded, and he's supposed to live a very normal life, where he can never really utilize his true potential. It's part of the whole frustration of being that character and what makes it relatable. Well, Peter now goes to Horizon High. Now, this isn't the first time Peter's gone to a specialist school. Peter goes to a specialist school in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it is more just kind of a science school. It's dedicated to science, but they generally have more of the other subjects too. They just have a lot of resources, and it's a school full of whiz kids, basically. In Marvel's Spider-Man, though, Horizon High is basically Hogwarts. This show spits science like it's nobody's business, but what it shows us is magic. So in Peter Parker's life now, he's going to have all kinds of gadgets and resources that are completely revolutionary. If you had an issue with Tony Stark's involvement in Peter's life in Spider-Man Homecoming, in this, literally every single student at this school is a little Tony Stark. And they're all preppy eggheads, just like Peter Parker. Oh boy. Now, to be honest, after this first episode, I don't really feel satisfied with what I've seen here. I don't really feel like I've got enough to really talk about this portrayal of Spider-Man in this world definitively, which is another key difference, is that Spectacular Spider-Man successfully shows us absolutely everything we need to know about this Spider-Man going forward. This one here introduces us to it, but it doesn't do anything further than that. So I'm gonna watch a second episode. See you in about half an hour. Okay, so it turns out that first episode was a two-parter. That probably explains why I wasn't very satisfied by what I saw. Okay, so there was a point in this episode where I thought maybe I'm wrong for judging this show in first impressions, because a lot of part 2 was about Peter and May's financial difficulties, and it kind of looked like it was going to bring Spider-Man back to that grounding that he needs as a character. So in this episode, Peter is basically exploring Horizon High and learning all about Horizon High, the students that go there, and Max Modell. Harry has been suspended from the school after being framed for sabotaging the rain cloud machine, and Peter is taking his place, but he's got kind of a guilt complex because he feels bad that Harry has to go back to Midtown where he was, and that he's getting Harry's lab. But Harry has asked him to take care of a few projects that Harry had left behind, which look a lot like pumpkin bombs. Peter also meets his personal mentor, Dr. Otto Octavius, who is also a young student at Horizon High, a rejected idea from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Spider-Man was having Dr. Octavius be a fellow student of Peter's. They don't go anywhere with this, it's really just a name drop. We also meet Miles Morales. Remember when I said this show was basically supposed to be a back-to-basics Spider-Man? Well, it can't be if Miles Morales is a major part of it, and his project is making a security robot. There is also Anya, who's got a tech-jamming gauntlet, which can shut down robots. Peter Parker needs to work on his own personal project because at this school all they do is invent stuff. There doesn't really appear to be any kind of classes or anything. Peter just gets a lab and he just has to invent things. So the first thing he invents is an upgraded Spider-Man costume, which he dearly needs when Alistair Smythe's Spider Slayer robot jumps into the school and causes a lot of trouble, almost killing Miles Morales, who Peter saves. The Spider Slayer gets away, but it gets worse for Peter as he finds out that Aunt May is looking through job after job after job so that she can afford to have Peter's tuition fees at Horizon High. Harry offers to pay, but Peter's already feeling guilty enough towards Harry. But he's also suspicious of the pumpkin bombs that he found in Harry's project. Now here's another issue, is Harry has invented a lot of tech himself, which defeats a lot of the object of Harry Osborn and his relationship with his father Norman Osborn, who we haven't seen yet admittedly. Now Norman Osborn is always disappointed in Harry Osborn but likes Peter Parker because Peter Parker is the prodigy that he believes Harry Osborn should have been, but Harry Osborn is just an average guy. He's not the heir to the Osborn legacy that Norman really had in mind. In this show though, Harry Osborn is a genius. Harry Osborn is an inventor. Harry Osborn would make a decent heir to the Osborn legacy. The issue is he now goes to Midtown High instead of Horizon High, which I'm guessing they're going to try to use, but it means that Harry is not the personal disappointment to Norman Osborn that he should be. This is going to be a problem if they try to tell the Harry Norman Osborn story properly later on. And it turns out that Harry's pumpkin bombs are exactly what the Spider Slayer wants. Right, so being as Aunt May can't really afford the tuition fees without getting job after job after job, drastically reducing her quality of life, Peter instead decides he's going to take responsibility for that and get a job as a janitor, even though it's not something he wanted as a kid. We set up this whole thing of Peter's ambitions were to be a major scientist so he'd never have to do manual labor. Now I know that a lot of kids are like this, but I can't help but think this is kind of an elitist message to have for this show. I mean, Uncle Ben does set him to right. He's like, hard work is the break our brain needs to come up with new ideas. So Peter does apply for a job as a janitor, otherwise he's going to have to give up his position at Horizon High. Now having Peter have a job as a janitor doing manual labor could give back to a little bit of that relatability and grounding that Peter Parker needs as a character to make this whole thing work. But Max Modell finds out that he applied to be the janitor and that he can't really afford to go to Horizon High, so he gives him a scholarship and makes him his personal assistant. And just like that, that's like the whole potential this thing had to go back to being Spider-Man properly is now gone back to just being Hogwarts again. The Spider Slayer attacks Harry once again, which Harry blames Spider-Man for. And so Anya and Max Modell are there, and Anya gets her jamming gauntlet device to defeat the Spider Slayer, and then Spider-Man uses Harry's pumpkin bombs to destroy the robot for good. And it's just, I don't know, having all these kids at Peter's school having super abilities and inventions of their own that are good enough to rival Tony Stark is... I can't really come up with the wording for why this doesn't work for me, unless I just repeat the same points over and over again. Look, even with a cartoon, suspension of disbelief is a factor, and having all of these kids that are Peter Parker's peers having Avengers-level tech that can defeat any bad guy. This is not Spider-Man anymore, this is Harry Potter. Spider-Man barely needs to even be there, to be honest. All these other kids have the potential to be superheroes of their own, and it just begs the question, why don't they? Why not, you know? A lot of the whole point and appeal of Spider-Man is very much lost in this show. And that's a shame, because this could be a lot of kids' first introduction to Spider-Man, and they're not really being introduced to Spider-Man for what he is, you know? I am all for new takes on things, but there comes a point where you have to treat a character for what they are. You have to treat an intellectual property for what it is. This Spider-Man may have some financial difficulties, but ultimately he's in the 1% to all intents and purposes, which is so far in the opposite direction of anything Spider-Man should ever be. And I know there's the argument of, it's a kids show. But Spectacular Spider-Man was also a kids show. And I don't just like that show because I grew up with it, because the Spider-Man I grew up with was actually the 90s Spider-Man animated series. Spectacular Spider-Man came about at the time where I was starting to grow out of cartoons. And just because a show understands the point of the character in the first place, that doesn't mean it's no longer appropriate for kids. Spider-Man stories have always been family stories. They've always been something that kids can cotton onto. This level of change, though, just takes away anything that could be relatable or resonate with any audience. And maybe stuff like that isn't too important to your average tot. Maybe that's not, what they're watching it for. Maybe they're watching it for the action, the curiosity that they get from the science stuff. But there are plenty of ways of implementing that in a show that respects the character and treats the character for what they are, and this is just not what Spider-Man is. But you know what? If it gets kids into Spider-Man, if this is their gateway which leads them to the movies or the comic books, then all power to it. My issue with this show is simply that it's tepid. Its storytelling is pretty sloppy and pretty inconsistent. As far as I'm concerned, it fails as a Spider-Man adaptation, it fails as a TV show, but as a show for kids, I don't know, there's enough there to spark curiosity, I guess. But I do feel like that's a cop-out, because there's no reason why a kid's Spider-Man show that treats the character for who he is can't work, and it's been proven. The thing I don't dig, though, is when you get kids in the comments section and they're saying that they really like this version of Spider-Man, it's their favorite show. And they're obviously young, probably about age 9 to 12. And then some 20-year-old comes in and says, "You got no taste, this is unintelligent, you're stupid. Spectacular Spider-Man was the best Spider-Man show, you're an idiot." And I've seen this, I've seen instances of this on the internet. And I'm just saying, if I see anyone behaving like this in my comments section, you won't be getting any respect from me anytime soon. I don't like this show. It's not my Spider-Man. It's not Spider-Man, in my opinion. I legitimately feel that the storytelling and the dialogue and everything like that is of a significantly lesser quality to the version of Spider-Man that I like. I don't just put this down to preference. But you know what? Maybe other people see something in this that you don't. And it honestly baffles me sometimes looking at my comment sections and seeing how few people understand subjectivity as it is. But when it comes to kids who this is their introduction to the character, don't berate them for this being their introduction to the character. Don't berate them for liking something that is current to them. For starters, let people like what they're gonna like. But why not recommend to them the Spider-Man show that you like? Why not recommend them MTV Spider-Man? Why not recommend them the 90s Spider-Man or Spectacular Spider-Man? If those shows really are so much better, then they'll come back and tell us. And then they as fans can make their voices heard, and then maybe we can get a better Spider-Man show. But you ain't gonna get anywhere by having a go at a bunch of kids for liking their version of the show better than yours. What do you guys think anyway? Comment below and discuss, and as always, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, don't forget to hit subscribe, hit the like button, and in the description below are links to my Patreon and my Discord. Channel Pup has been growing more than I could ever have anticipated over this very short space of time, and I'm absolutely honored to see so many viewers participating in discussions and really enjoying my little projects here. But it's not without its obstacles. I'm currently a student studying film and television, and if I want to afford the general costs that come with living, unfortunately YouTube revenue just can't always cut that cheese. I recently moved in with my girlfriend's family, but this is not a permanent thing, it's just for the summer. And last year I've done the whole act of balancing YouTube, balancing a job, and balancing university, and trust me, the content suffers every single time. So to support this channel to maintain the same quality of content and upload schedule, and to just keep making the stuff you guys really seem to be enjoying, I really do urge you to check out my Patreon link in the description below. And in return, you can get early access previews to the special Channel Pup events such as Marvelous Tales of Spider-Man Episode 2, as well as my upcoming Patreon exclusive playlist, Pup's Project Room, which is all unlockable with a pledge of just $1 or more. Now, the world's a tricky place. Not everybody is made of money, and that's fine. Just please be here for my videos. Please don't stop coming back to join me on these discussions, because it means so much to me, guys, really. Well, I guess I best be hitting the old dusty trail. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I've been Channel Pup, and I'll think of a better catchphrase next time. Now please leave me alone!